Ever since I watched Mandalorian, I wanted to build my own helmet. Today, I'm finally making that happen.
This is the way.
Before we start off, I actually recommend this helmet build for anyone's first helmet, and that's due to how straightforward it is and it just being such a popular helmet in general. With it being a really beginner friendly helmet, there's also a slight more messiness than more advanced helmets. And by messy, I mean you getting dirty. So, anyways, let's start. So, a quick run through in the slicer. This model is off of MakerWorld, and if you could print the whole helmet in one shot, of course it would be better, but if you can't, just cut it up and connect it back later after the printing process. But since I'm using a P1S printer, I could just print it one shot with just some rotation adjustments. And do scale this helmet to your head size. I already printed out the test ring for this helmet, and the original size already fits me just fine. By the way, the test ring, if it's even slightly bends when you put it on, or slightly tight, I recommend you just to scale it up. Trust me. And now all we need to do is remove the supports within the helmet. The print can actually support itself and it doesn't need the support inside anyways. There's just gonna be slight stringing on the inside, but that's fine because we're gonna be covering it with foam anyways later. And plus, you're just saving material all around, so why not? So now all we gotta do is just set our quality and print. I'm using PETG to print this specific helmet for the higher durability and just higher heat resistance in general. So when you go out in cosplay, the heat just doesn't warp the helmet. And with the added benefit of PETG, just sands way easier than PLA. But PLA still just works just fine. Now once that everything is printed, we can move on to the post-processing. I started off by just applying some putty to just seal off some of the big noticeable imperfections. I'm using some wall sealant putty, but you could use some wood filler or Bondo. So after letting the putty dry for a few hours, I'll start sanding down everything using 120 grit sandpaper. I'm not starting off with 80 grit because the print is already quite decently smooth, and using this foot sander, by the way, I highly recommend. And after our first pass of sanding, I'm just going to start priming the helmet. And before you prime your helmet, do clean off any dust that is remaining on the helmet. I went on heavier for the primer to just cover up more of the layer lines. I'm using Anchor filler primer for this helmet. I specifically went on heavier on the vents on the back because it just has more imperfections that I couldn't get into as well even with sandpaper. So after that, I'll let it dry laying face up the vent side, so like gravity can just even out all the filler primer on the surface. And now we'll move on to some wet sanding. The difference between wet sanding and just normal sanding is that wet sanding can make your prints way smoother, and it prevents your sandpaper from gunking up from all the dust and filler primer built up, which also saves you way more sandpaper than just traditional sanding. I'm using a 240 grit sandpaper here for the second pass. For the second layer of primer, I'm just trying to go more heavier on specific spots that just doesn't feel smooth yet. And after all that, we can just let it dry for like an hour or so. And I'll move on to the third pass of sanding. I'm using 400 grit this time, and one last heavy coat of primer afterwards as well. But before we go any further, I wanted to start doing the visor first. So all I did was press a sheet of paper onto the gap on the front of the helmet, and I started tracing the outline for the gap. When you cut the guide, make sure that you leave some space on the side to where you could glue it on later. So now that we have our guide, we can move on to actually making the actual visor. So what we need is just a clear sheet of acrylic, and I'm using an 85% window tint. Depending on how much you want it to be darkened, you could choose, but I'm just using 85. So all we gotta do is prep the acrylic sheet and make sure it's clean before we lay on the tint. because we don't want any dust to get trapped under it. And as you lay on the tint, start pushing out any excess air bubbles. There's definitely a learning curve to this, so take your time. And once we have our visor ready, I'll follow the guide and cut it all out. Now that you have your visor, set this aside, we'll move back to the helmet. I'll be layering on a gloss black by this brand called Sprayman as a base coat, because from what I saw from the movie, I really liked how it was on the darker side. So we'll be going with this gloss black. This part is so satisfying for me because once you start spraying on the black paint, it looks so shiny and reflective. Go on this with thin coats and gradually build up the color. We'll now move on to what is essentially called a guide coat. I actually learned this from Frankly Built. So essentially what it is you spray on another shade. You will sand over to be able to see any unsmooth spots that you may still have. So basically after the black, I'll sand it down, and anything above the black that gets sanded off is basically just an unevened out surface, so it becomes way smoother. I sanded this piece with 1000 grit sandpaper until it looks and feels insanely smooth. And now we'll move on to another coat of primer just to really add to that reflective surface. So after the primer, I went with another gloss black coat, this being the final base coat for the actual helmet, and it came out so good. It's like a mirror, dude. Anyways, now we can move on to what is essentially the most fun part of the whole entire build, which is applying graphite powder. I'm using the Creator Color graphite powder here. Don't get the charcoal powder, we want graphite powder. Do be careful when you're using these stuff because it can get really messy. I used a cotton pad and started dabbing it with the graphite powder and onto the helmet. I went in circular motions just so the helmet gets coated more evenly, and this is the part where you can just see how clear and reflective your helmet has become. I decided to lay on a clear coat so I can put on a second layer of graphite just to make it look even shinier and more metallic. Do remember to test out if your paint is compatible with the graphite powder or not, because it might lead to possible peeling and just ruin the whole helmet, and we don't want that. I applied a 1K gloss clear coat by Samurai and then let the helmet sit for about a day. Then I'll apply the last and final layer of graphite, and the helmet is practically done. Now taking back the visor we made earlier, I'll just mold it into the helmet and then hot glue it down. After I took some foam that I had lying around from packages and started gluing them in some of the parts that may feel sharp when I put on the helmet, mainly just the cheeks and the top of the helmet. And now, I present to you the completed Mando helmet. This was actually such a fun helmet to make, and I hope you guys had just as much fun watching. If you guys do have any questions that you may have, do leave them in the comments and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Anyways, thank you so much for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao!